News now.
Okay, so let's review some of the biggest foreign policy changes that Biden has begun to make in his first few weeks in office. Pat, what do you think are the most significant of these changes in terms of reorientation in U.S. foreign policy?
Well, the first thing I think we should realize is the scope of these changes. It's been dramatic in the last couple of weeks. We shouldn't say it was surprising because in many ways, Biden has been implementing the promises that he made during the campaign. But I think we should start by talking about these broader attempts to restore multilateralism, the willingness and the desire of the United States to engage in multilateral cooperative relationships with other states in the international system to solve common problems. Biden has deliberately elevated the importance of multilateralism in his foreign policy agenda. And we can see this in a number of decisions. On the first day in office, and this was intentional, President Biden issues an executive order stating that the United States has an intent to rejoin the Paris Climate Accords. We're going to talk about this a little bit later when we get into the grand strategy conversation, but it's important to realize that there's a significant elevation of the climate change threat in Biden's overall foreign policy orientation. And so rejoining the Paris Climate Accords is really central to the foreign policy changes that he's implemented in a very short period of time. We can also see these attempts to restore multilateralism in the efforts to rejoin the World Health Organization in the broader struggle to fight the global pandemic. It was intentional that in the first week or two of office, Anthony Fauci addressed the World Health Organization to try and restore America's position within that body. And then finally, the Biden team has hinted that they might be willing to rejoin the Iran nuclear accord under a certain set of conditions, more explicitly with the expectation that Iran will halt its enrichment of uranium, and it wants Iran to adopt further changes in its foreign policy, including halting support for terrorist elements in the broader region. The larger point here is, though, we see a movement, an intentional movement under President Biden to go back and embrace multilateral cooperation as an important means of achieving U.S. foreign policy goals. So if we talk about multilateralism, now let's talk about immigration, Rob, because I see lots of changes in U.S. foreign policy very quickly in the last 3 weeks. What has Biden done, and how has this reversal changed and threatened some of Trump's priorities?
Well, first, to think about these changes in immigration, one does need to emphasize how smart were to administration when he was entering office. And so Donald Trump elevated the idea that restricting immigration was good for the United States in terms and American workers in terms of protecting jobs, but also a national security threat. And what Biden has done in his first days in office is to really try to to undo those policies that the Trump administration introduced regarding immigration. And so first and foremost, he proposes a comprehensive immigration reform package to Congress. And this will be the biggest and hardest thing to accomplish because it would have to be legislation that would make it through both the House of Representatives and the Senate, which is going to be a huge lift for the Biden administration. But what this was at the centerpiece.
Rob, can I stop you for a second? So why is it such a hurdle to get through the Senate? Can you briefly tell them why? A legislative solution here on immigration would be so hard?
Well, the problem is that the Senate is evenly divided 50-50 between Democrats and Republicans. And so the Democrats hold the slimmest of majorities only through the ability of the vice president, Kamala Harris, to break ties. And immigration is a cross-cutting issue enough, at least, that there will be some difficulty for the Democrats to get complete buy-in and support for these comprehensive immigration reform package within its own caucus, but also because it will have a really hard time getting any sort of Republican support. That unless they do away with the filibuster, which is a separate conversation, most major pieces of legislation in the Senate don't need just 50 votes, but would need 60 votes in the Senate, which means support from a significant number of Republicans, and that would be a really tough thing to achieve when it comes to immigration, which has become such a lightning rod for Republicans since Donald Trump became the centerpiece of Republican politics when he got elected. And so this will be a really big issue to do through legislation, although Biden has already done a lot of things that I will talk about in just a second through simply executive orders and action. And so let me just kind of catalog some of the proposed changes. The proposed change is to restore the protections for DACA, which is a program for immigrants who were brought to the United States as young children and has a widespread support from the American public in general and from quarters within both the Republican and Democratic parties. But secondly, and more controversially, this comprehensive immigration reform proposed by Biden offers a path to legal working status and eventually citizenship for the roughly 11 million undocumented people that have been physically living in the United States as of January 1st of this year, 2021. And so that broader immigration reform that would lead to eventual pathway to citizenship for most undocumented people here living in the United States would be a huge change in U.S. immigration law. In addition to that big centerpiece legislation, the Biden administration has taken some executive action to first reunite children separated from their families at the border during the Trump administration. Secondly, he took executive action to end the travel ban that was imposed by the Trump administration for a group of majority Muslim countries, the Muslim travel ban that was so controversial in the first years of the Trump administration. And thirdly, President Biden has moved to increase refugees allowed into the United States to 125,000 per year, up from only 15,000 per year under the Trump administration. And he noted this specifically in his speech yesterday, because he said that the United States needs to reassert its values of protecting the vulnerable from war-torn regions and from discrimination around the world by being a country that is welcoming and tolerant of refugees. And so those three were specific changes done through executive action to undo policies by the Trump administration that restricted immigration in general and took a specific target on refugees and a travel ban on majority Muslim countries.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about Russia, Rob. I know that this is always your favorite part of the course, but one of the things that's been interesting for me to observe is how intentional the public messaging has been by the Biden administration, President Biden, and the White House press secretary in terms of categorizing this relationship as an adversarial one. They're clearly signaling to the rest of the world, to President Putin, that it's going to be, there's a new sheriff in town, there's a new regime in town. Could you give us a little bit of background on what's going on? And I should say too, part of this is the White House press secretary she's been asked repeatedly, is the U.S. going to pursue sanctions against Russia for its actions, particularly the extensive cyber attack against the United States last fall? And she has intentionally said, we reserve the right to do this. We're to react at the time of our choosing, to raise the costs on Russia, implying that there's a broader reassessment in U.S. foreign policy and there could be some penalties, a significant change from Trump. So what's going on in U.S.-Russia relations? And in particular, in the last week, President Biden has talked about this situation with respect to Navalny in Russia. Can you give us a little bit of background on this?
Sure. And so Alexei Navalny is the most prominent opposition figure in Russia. And this individual was poisoned, by all accounts, from Russian security services back in August of 2020, and he nearly died. He was flown to Germany for treatment and recovered. And in that whole episode, Alexei Navalny has asserted that President Vladimir Putin and his security services intentionally tried to kill him and remove him as a sort of thorn in their side in terms of leading the opposition. What's important to know about Navalny now is that after recovering in Germany, he intentionally returned to Russia despite being warned that he would be arrested upon his return. And he did this to maintain the pressure on the Russian state for democratic reforms and opposition to the Putin regime. His intent, Alexei Navalny's intent, as he publicly has stated, is to bring down the Russian political system, which he views as authoritarian, and to provide a new impetus toward greater political freedoms, more competitive elections, and a more democratic system in Russia. He returns to Russia at the very beginning of 2021, actually days before Biden was inaugurated, and then he was promptly arrested. And this sparked some of the largest protests in favor of freeing Navalny from his prison sentence that Russia has seen since the end of communism, and a round of major protests in 2011 and 2012 over election fraud. And so this has upset the Russian political system. It has brought in a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen in Russia. And so what has the Biden administration signaled? A few things. What Biden has said publicly in this speech from yesterday, but also at other times, is that the United States demands that Russia release Navalny, that they allow him his freedom of speech and his rights as a Russian citizen, not to be imprisoned and not to be silenced. And this is a signal not just to Russia, but also other authoritarian regimes, that the United States is going to once again showcase its values by sticking up for political freedoms, democratic oppositions, and against authoritarian regimes. And so that's a big part of this. But also when it comes to Russia, what Biden has signaled is that the United States is going to change Trump administration policy, which at least implicitly has tried to foster less adversarial relations with Russia and to sort of ignore some of the more aggressive moves made by Russia in Ukraine, but also in election interference and the cyber attack on governmental and non-governmental internet space in the United States by Russia, and to call all of those things out, to publicly acknowledge them, and to threaten retaliation against them. And that, I'd say, is the heart of a new sort of realist kind of approach to Russia as an actor that has contrary interests and contrary motives to U.S. national interests. That this is one country that is consciously acting against U.S. interests. And that's a big shift from the Trump administration. So that's my take on the U.S.-Russian relations. They can and have found common ground on mutual interests, the most important being that they right away extended what's called the New START Treaty, which is the last remaining nuclear arms limitation treaty between the United States and Russia, because it was in the interest of both the United States and Russia. But outside of that, there's a lot of adversarial talk and action by the Biden administration to start to get tough with Russia again, and to sort of reverse the kind of approach that the Trump administration used. So let's go on to talk about one final set of foreign policy changes. And Pat, how has Biden begun to reorient U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East?
So two things I want to point our attention to. The first is the restoration of the diplomatic relationship with the Palestinian Authority, the government that represents the Palestinian people. And the Biden administration has signaled that it is going to resume foreign aid to the Palestinians. So there was a statement issued about U.S. interests in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict a couple of weeks ago. The U.S. is going to discourage Israel from building new settlements in the West Bank. It wants a long-term peace settlement or set around the two-state solution. But significant difference here is integrating the Palestinian Authority into the larger diplomatic process again. The second big story in U.S. foreign policy, also announced yesterday in President Biden's speech, is the U.S. is halting its support for offensive military operations, principally now by Saudi Arabia, in the war in Yemen. The U.S. has extended some support to Saudi Arabia and the UAE over the last 4 years or so. I should be clear. So this dates back to the Obama administration. The Obama administration started this policy supporting Saudi Arabia and the UAE in fighting the Houthi rebels in Yemen, the Houthi rebels are aligned with the Iranians. It's really been a bloody civil war with extensive civilian casualties. The Saudi Arabia has come under heavy public criticism for the attacks that it has made against civilians in Yemen, huge humanitarian catastrophe. President Biden campaigned on pulling support. He did that officially yesterday. The truth is there was very little support left. The Biden administration, very little American support left, largely training of Saudi military officials. The U.S. had halted refueling support for Saudi planes flying sorties over Yemen a couple years ago under the Trump administration. But the Biden administration is also halting some arms exports to the UAE and Saudi Arabia and signaling that the U.S. is going to be reassessing its relationship with the kingdoms in the Persian Gulf, where they had, during the Trump administration, had gotten much closer to the United States. That's probably not going to be the case under the Biden administration. All right, so let's step back now and put these bigger foreign policy changes in some perspective. We want to make an argument that they reflect a bigger change in U.S. national interests. or the goals that are guiding U.S. foreign policy. And these changes occurred as a result of the election, right? We can trace them back to the election. Here we want to recall our conversation, our introductory conversation that we had about U.S. foreign policy, where we talked about national interests. And the point we want to emphasize here is that obviously we have democracy in the United States, and democratic elections are an important institutional mechanism that has real significant consequences for U.S. foreign policy. By providing an institutional mechanisms, an institutional mechanism that takes all of our individual interests over foreign policy and then translate it into a collective national interest. What that means is the outcome of elections can reorient how the United States interacts with the world. And we've seen that over the last 3 weeks with the inauguration of President Biden. We see an intentional reconstruction or reorientation or reversing of many foreign policy changes that were implemented under President Trump. What Biden is telling the rest of the world is the U.S. has very different national interests under a Democratic, under the leadership of the Democratic Party and a Democratic President Biden. And so what this tells us is how significant presidential elections are in U.S. foreign policy, right? We see this dramatic reorientation of the national interest. And again, right, what elections do is they're a mechanism to aggregate individual interests, right? They transform the interests of U.S. citizens into the collective interest of the state. And I think it's important to realize that these election process, because it's 50% plus one, this is necessarily an exclusionary process. So groups that supported President Trump's tighter immigration restrictions, or groups that supported the U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accords, their interests are much less likely to be represented in Biden's foreign policy, right? This elections, these institutions, this process of transforming individual interests into a collective interest are necessarily exclusionary, even in a democracy. There is a new sheriff in town, which means that the United States has very different national interests, which is then going to shape how it interacts with the rest of the world. As we already noted, we can see this in U.S. relations with Russia, and we can begin to see this in U.S. relations with the Palestinian Authority, with Saudi Arabia, and the UAE.
Okay, so elections matter, and this last election in 2020 elected a new president, which then has aggregated interests and a coalition that has a different set of national interests and priorities. So now let's move from a discussion of empirics, or the changes that we've observed in U.S. foreign policy over the past 2 weeks, to a more general conceptual discussion about some of the organizing principles, or maybe elements of grand strategy that are potentially driving the Biden foreign policy agenda. And as we've already said, we're not ready to locate Biden yet on the continuum of grand strategies. He's just started his presidency. However, we can detect some core principles or threats that he has identified, and some policy mechanisms that seem to be guiding Biden's approach so far. And we want to highlight 3 of these processes, right? And mechanisms. One is democratic alliances. He wants to work through democratic alliances to achieve his goals. And the second is a threat. And his major threat so far that he has identified and emphasized is climate change as a national security threat. And this is a huge change from the previous administration. And then thirdly, he has explicitly organized a grand strategy in U.S. foreign policy that is interconnected with domestic politics. So grand strategy as domestic politics. And we are going to use a couple of clips from Biden's State Department speech from on Thursday to set up these conversations. And so we're going to start with a clip here that emphasizes the need to fuse the promotion of democracy and multilateral cooperation in U.S. foreign policy. So let's go ahead and run that clip right now.
We must meet the new moment, accelerating global challenges, from the pandemic to the climate crisis to nuclear proliferation, challenging the will only to be solved by nations working together and in common. We can't do it alone. That must be we must start with diplomacy, rooted in America's most cherished democratic values, defending freedom, championing opportunity, upholding universal rights, respecting the rule of law, and treating every person with dignity. That's the grounding wire of our global policy, our global power. That's our inexhaustible source of strength. That's America's abiding advantage. Though many of these values have come under intense pressure in recent years, even pushed to the brink in the last few weeks, the American people are going to emerge from this moment stronger, more determined, and better equipped to unite the world in fighting to defend democracy, because we have fought for it ourselves. Over the past few days, we've been in close cooperation with our allies and partners to bring together the international community to address the military coup in Burma. I've also been in touch with Leader McDonald to discuss our shared concerns about the situation in Burma, and we are united in our resolve. There can be no doubt, in a democracy, force should never seek to overrule the will of the people or attempt to erase the outcome of a credible election. The Burmese military should relinquish power they have seized, release the advocates and activists and officials they have detained, lift the restrictions on telecommunications, and refrain from violence. As I said earlier this week, we will work with our partners to support restoration of democracy and the rule of law and impose consequences on those responsible. Over the past 2 weeks, I've spoken with the leaders of many of our closest friends: Canada, Mexico, the UK, Germany, France, NATO, Japan, South Korea, Australia, to reforming the habits of cooperation and rebuilding the muscle of democratic alliances that have atrophied over the past few years of neglect and, I would argue, abuse. America and alliances are our greatest asset. And leading with diplomacy means standing shoulder to shoulder with our allies and key partners once again.
So let me highlight 3 things from this clip here, on which I would group around this concept of democratic alliances. And so first, there's this embrace, this demand to talk about the importance of restoring democracy in the United States. Democracy at home is the source of U.S. power in the world, soft power. It makes other countries want to participate in cooperative ventures with the United States. But this restoration of democracy at home means upholding universal rights and the rule of law. It means respecting human rights. Later in the speech, Biden is going to talk about this means fighting systemic racism in the United States and protecting LGBTQ rights both at home and abroad. So a central component of this is American power in the world rests on the vitality of its democracy. And so his administration needs to do all that it can to restore the vitality of that democracy. Related to this embrace of democracy is the desire of the United States to promote democracy abroad. And this comes in the discussion about the coup in Myanmar. And although we didn't show it here, the criticism of protests in Russia centered around the jailing of Navalny. So Biden criticizes the coup in Myanmar, demands that the military there relinquishes power and frees its activists, says that the United States is consulting with its allies about this and is considering imposing penalties. The other thing that I think is significant here in this portion of the speech is he talks about, I've talked with Republican leader Mitch McConnell on this, we agree. He's signaling to the rest of the world that there is bipartisan support to do something on Myanmar, but I think he's also signaling that there's bipartisan support for democracy promotion abroad. Now, it's unclear about the steps that the United States will take to support democracy abroad. That's vague, not talking about mechanisms, but it's significant, at least rhetorically. This is a signal to the broader world. And then finally, Biden is emphasizing the value of multilateral cooperation with Democratic partners. I think this has been intentional over the last 6 months in Biden's statements about his foreign policy. He wants to embrace multilateral cooperation, but wants to embrace multilateral cooperation in particular with the U.S.'s Democratic partners. So he name drops a bunch of Democratic states and says alliances have been a critical source of strength for American influence around the world, but they've been neglected in the last 4 years, he implies, right? So what the U.S. wants to do is preserve and strengthen these alliances with other democracies. The other thing that I think is significant, and we can see this in Biden's foreign policy too, when he gets asked a question about what are you going to do about China, Russia, Iran, his fallback mechanism or fallback response is, we will consult with our democratic alliance partners. He wants to act multilaterally, but more importantly, he wants to embrace partners that have the same set of domestic institutions, namely democracy, as the United States. Now, second, we want to talk a little bit about Biden has elevated the importance of climate change as a core national security threat. How has he done that? Intentionally, on the very first day, rejoins the Paris Climate Accord. We already talked about this. As part of these efforts, the United States is going to change how it regulates fossil fuels. It's going to change emission standards for cars through executive orders. Same thing with respect to trying to limit methane emissions from oil and gas wells in the United States. There's going to be an effort to try and get rid of electricity from fossil fuels, but that's going to be a challenge because it's probably going to require a legislative solution, and Rob already talked about the challenges associated with that. You need to get past the filibuster, 60 votes. The other thing that's standing in his way is a senator from West Virginia that has strong interests in preserving coal. But apart from these policy changes, I think it's also important to recognize how Biden is trying to change the foreign policy bureaucracy in the United States to reorient and elevate climate change, to reorient American foreign policy towards the challenges of climate change and reinforce its centrality of a core U.S. national security threat or interest. So he has created a climate envoy, John Kerry, who we just showed you on the picture on the last slide. He has a position on the National Security Council, so he's going to be part of all these conversations. Kerry's role is to act as the U.S. ambassador in a broader multilateral cooperative arrangements organized around Paris to try to get other states to limit their carbon dioxide emissions. And so significant changes. The other thing that was interesting in the speech at the State Department is that he said he's tasking the State Department with, we want you to insert climate change in all of U.S. diplomatic relationships with every other country in the world. So when the U.S. assesses its relationship with Germany, with Brazil, with South Africa, diplomats are going to be tasked with asking these states, what are you doing about climate change? That is a significant element of this as well. It's going to be core, it's going to be at the core of U.S. diplomacy moving forward. Okay, so in this final part of our discussion on grand strategy, Rob, did I get all that? We got domestic politics, we got climate change. Was I missing something else?
We're going to talk about the fusion of domestic politics and foreign policy now.
Yeah, that's right. Okay.
We're going to run a split.
So in this final part, I was thinking that we were going to move to something else first. But okay, so in this final part of this discussion on grand strategy, we want to talk about what Rob just said, this fusion of domestic politics and foreign policy. So Biden is intentionally trying to construct a foreign policy agenda that can generate domestic political support. He's trying to convince Americans that they should have an interest in turning away from isolationism and embracing U.S. leadership in the international system again. This might be an uphill battle, but we will first want to illustrate this argument with another clip from his speech yesterday. So let's go ahead and run that.
So with your help, the United States will again lead, not just by the example of our power, but the power of our example. That's why my administration has already taken the important step to live our domestic values at home, our democratic values at home. Within hours of taking office, I signed an executive order overturning the hateful, discriminatory Muslim ban, reversed the ban on transgender individuals serving in our military. As part of our commitment to truth, transparency, and accountability, we stated on day one, we started in day one with daily briefings of the press from the White House. We've reinstituted regular briefings here at State and at the Pentagon. We believe a free press isn't an adversary. Rather, it's essential. A free press is essential to the health of a democracy. We've restored our commitment to science and to create policies grounded in facts and evidence. I suspect Ben Franklin would approve. We've taken steps to acknowledge and address systemic racism and the scourge of white supremacy in our own country. Racial equity will not just be an issue for one department in our administration. It has to be the business of the whole of government in all our federal policies and institutions. All this matters to foreign policy because when we host the Summit of Democracies early in my administration, to rally the nations of the world to defend democracy globally, to push back the authoritarianism as advanced, we'll be a much more credible partner because of these efforts to shore up our own foundations. There's no longer a bright line between foreign and domestic policy. Every action we take in our conduct abroad, we must take with American working families in mind. Advancing a foreign policy for the middle class demands urgent focus on our domestic economic renewal. And that's why I immediately put forth the American Rescue Plan to pull us out of this economic crisis. That's why I signed an executive order strengthening our Buy American policies last week. And it's also why I work with Congress to make far-reaching investments in research and development of transformational technologies. These investments are going to create jobs, maintain America's competitive edge globally, and ensure all Americans share in the dividends.
Okay, so let's start with the end of this clip for some takeaway points. What Biden is signaling here is that he wants U.S. foreign policy, especially economic policy, to be centered around support for the American middle class. He is emphasizing economic investment as development within the United States that will restore America's international competitiveness and create jobs for the middle class. And so he doesn't want to have an economic foreign policy that comes at the cost of working families and middle class families, but instead helps to build up their economic status. And that's an important element that he's going to try to build around so that he can get some public support, some widespread public support for his foreign policy moves. And then the next key element of this tie between domestic politics and U.S. foreign policy is this issue of democracy. He argues that the United States needs to restore democracy at home. And he mentions a couple of specific points: respect for the role of the press and a free press as vital to a functioning democracy. And this, again, is a counter to the previous administration's attack on the press and the characterization of the mainstream press as some sort of enemy of the people. Instead, he wants to embrace a free press as the centerpiece of democracy. And he also made a point that the United States needs to take on systemic racism and protect human rights, such as LGBTQ rights, as a way of promoting the sort of values that the United States wants to take to the international realm to promote those at home as well. And note how he argues a connection or a boomerang effect here between promotion of individual rights and human rights at home and abroad, and how they reinforce one another. Promoting individual and human rights abroad can strengthen those same rights domestically. And in order to effectively promote human rights and individual liberties and democracy abroad, you have to have a vibrant democracy at home so that other countries will respect and follow you. And so that's the connection for the Biden administration between the domestic and the international. We need to rebuild both economically and politically a vibrant economy and a vibrant democracy in order to lead the world, especially in the defense of democracy against authoritarianism. And so now we want to finish our discussion today by asking about the plausibility of this approach. Will Biden be able to do what he promises? What political constraints is he going to face in trying to implement and sustain some of these foreign policy changes? And so, Pat, what do you think?
So first, let's bring us back to the very first module that we talked about in class in the international system. And we talked about the structure of international politics and how it rested in some ways on the distribution of economic, political, and military power. And I think here we need to recognize that this global structure of power is changing. And one of the principal drivers of this is the rise of China. And what this means is that Biden is simply going to have less tools to exert exert American leadership than what presidents did 15 or 20 years ago. The game has changed, in part because of the explosive growth of the Chinese economy, but at the same time, China has cultivated interests with many states around the world. In Africa, it's expanded its influence in the South China Sea, and it's also expanding its influence in Europe. And there's an interesting story here that I want to talk about that occurred in December that I think gives us some sense of this increasing structural constraints that Biden is going to face, structural constraints associated with U.S. decline and the growth of Chinese influence. So the European Union began negotiating an extensive trade deal with China about 6 or 7 years ago. This trade deal gained a ton of momentum in the fall and was completed in December when President Xi of China made a series of important concessions to the European Union. Now, this was tricky for the Biden administration because it intentionally didn't want to be acting as a president until the inauguration. Biden's national security advisor drops a tweet in December, basically hinting to leaders of the European Union, please wait till you complete these negotiations with China because we'd like to participate in with them. And if he's tweeting about this, there was clearly back-channel conversations about this. The larger point here is the United States wanted to be a participant in these trade negotiations because it was concerned that Europe was reorienting its economy towards China and away from the United States in light of a series of trade actions and sanctions or the growth of tariffs on European exports to the United States during the Trump administration. Well, what did Europe do? In particular, what did Germany do, led by Angela Merkel? They said, thanks, but no thanks. We're going to go ahead and complete this deal. And they effectively left the United States out of these agreements. We shouldn't be surprised at this. In part, there is a growing concern in Europe. They're clearly going to embrace the Biden administration and the rhetoric and the desire for broader multilateralism. But there's a real concern in Europe now about what follows the Biden administration. And then why don't we use this story to talk about the next second, structural constraint here that the United States faces. So there's the structural constraint associated with the shift in power in the world, declining American influence. The other thing, though, is that the United States has a long-term contracting problem now with the rest of the world. And the rest of the world is asking themselves, can U.S. multilateralism be sustained? If U.S. multilateral cooperation was the bedrock of the international order after 1945, that changed in 2017. And Europeans the rest of the world sees this embrace of multilateralism by President Biden, but they say, what's going to happen later? There's uncertainty about the trajectory of U.S. foreign policy, right? So Trump embraced going it alone and bilateral cooperation and, criticizing U.S. traditional allies, and that was a winner in the short run for his presidency. It really cultivated nationalist support, and it strengthened him among its base because he was telling a message that the U.S. is going to focus on rebuilding, and U.S. policy is going to focus on rebuilding the United States. But in the long run, this was damaging for the United States because other countries around the world are now concerned about rapid and significant changes in U.S. foreign policy depending on who's holding the White House. And so what this means is there are real costs to making concessions to the United States in international negotiations if they're going to be undone by the next president. And we see this in the Iran nuclear accord, and we see this in the Paris Climate Accord. And so Biden is going to have a problem here in getting U.S. allies to make concessions because they're not going to have a lot of confidence that those concessions can survive President Biden. And this brings us back to the larger constraint here. So we've got this contracting problem between the United States and the rest of the world, but much of this rests on domestic politics. And the question that these allies and other countries around the world are asking is, can Biden's foreign policies outlast his administration? And one of the challenges here is making policy through executive orders versus congressionally approved legislation. When presidents can't get support from Congress about some foreign policy initiative, they do it through executive orders. We saw this in immigration and climate change. The problem is that it then can't survive the next administration. And so this is going to be a huge problem for President Biden in getting other countries to embrace his climate agenda because they're going to be skeptical about any concessions that the United States makes or any promises that the United States makes about restricting carbon emissions. So in the long run, it's going to be hard for President Biden to sustain these multilateral collaborative efforts because there's a deep uncertainty in the rest of the world about U.S. domestic politics and whether or not there's going to be this cycling back and forth between Republican and Democratic presidencies. All right, Rob, so let's bring us back to the question that we started with. Is America back?
So I would say America wants to be back, right? If by being back, President Biden means that it's going to re-engage with its traditional allies and end this sort of America first mentality where the United States takes action without consulting allies and tries to be more confrontational and bilateral in its approach to various countries, then I would say yes, it's back to a different type of foreign policy that is more multilateral, more diplomatic, and wants to be a leader in the world, especially a leader of democratic alliances. But can it be back in the same sort of role that it traditionally played from the end of World War II through the decade or so, or 2 decades of unipolar American power after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War? And that, as you've already kind of pointed out, is much less certain and probably has a lot of obstacles against it because of the relative decline of U.S. power, but also because of internal domestic divisions that really sort of paralyze presidents from making long-term policy changes, right? And so this is a problem not just for Democrats, but also for Republicans. The Republican president, Donald Trump, tried to reorient U.S. foreign policy to America first. He had one term. He did it mostly through executive actions, and they are all undone in 2 weeks, or most of it is undone in 2 weeks under a new President Biden. And if the same thing happens to a President Biden in the next election in 2024, and a different president comes in and undoes all of the climate change executive orders and immigration executive orders that the Biden administration implements, then it's going to be hard for the U.S. to lead.
I would agree. I think absolutely right. There's going to be this re-engagement but whether or not it can be sustained is really questionable. And I think the final thought that I would just add here is we should remember that leadership relies on the acknowledgement of the authority. Other parties have to be willing to follow. And so Biden is talking in the speeches that we showed you, right? He believes that the restoration of democratic processes, the press, the rule of law, doing away with systemic racism and discrimination more broadly, that this is central to reestablishing U.S. authority and trying to give other countries a reason to follow the United States. But a second part of that is whether or not the U.S. can follow through on these promises and these changes. And that's also part of leadership, solving that long-term contracting problem. And I think it's fair to say that there's lots of doubt in the world right now about how durable the changes that Biden wants to implement will be. So that's got to be our final word for today, unless you had anything else to add, Rob.
Well, I would say one last thing is that certain elements of the Biden administration's foreign policy will be easier to pull off than others. And I would say the real telltale aspect of that is how much bipartisan support there is for some of these moves. A get tougher with Russia foreign policy is not only popular in the Democratic Party, but is also popular and supported by key elements of a Republican Party. And so there won't be a lot of opposition to that. Whereas huge changes on climate change and immigration will have much greater opposition. So he'll win on some and he'll lose on others, or at least face a lot of opposition on others.
The key is unity. Is that what you're saying?
The key is unity. And what's interesting is that's what he ran on. That's what his inaugural speech was on. Yeah. But what you're finding is that it's hard to find unity on the big things that are really controversial.
Yep.
And then he's got a choice. And so far, what he's chosen is to go ahead, right? He isn't going to compromise on climate change, or at least he's not signaling a lot of compromise on that yet. He wants to go big. Same thing with pandemic relief. And I think that there's trade-offs there that are going to be really tough for him to navigate. But if he can find a policy that has more broad support, that's what he should emphasize, and get a few wins under his belt, maybe.
Yeah, he's got about a year to get this done, and then everyone's going to be focused on the 2022 midterms. Well, that's going to be the final word for today. Thanks. I'm sure we'll continue to be talking about Biden's foreign policy and get into more of the details of the specific issues as the semester rolls on. We'll see you next time.